I would do what I've been arguing for in Parliament for years now. Treating the climate emergency like an emergency means structuring something like a wartime cabinet. You need to take every party in the House in the same room and work on it together. We need to do what the Biden administration has done, which is recognize the climate crisis can't be treated as an issue for the Minister of Environment alone. It needs to be seen as a national security issue with a whole of government response, and then you get serious. This is an urgent crisis, it's an emergency. And so when you look at one top issue, what's existential? If we don't get the climate emergency right, as C.D. Howe said in the Second World War when he was asked, are we spending too much money? He said, if we don't win the war, nothing else matters. If we don't reduce greenhouse gas emissions rapidly enough to hold on to a livable climate, nothing else matters.
Is there such a thing as a good war? According to Seth Klein, there is, especially when the enemy poses a threat to not just human life, but the world as we know it. For Klein, that enemy is anthropogenic climate change, and he says we need to rally the Canadian government and its citizens in a war on CO2 emissions. Klein, in his book, dug deep into the strategies used during the Second World War and discovered how wartime propaganda and community efforts can be repurposed today for a Green New Deal. So is Klein's belief that we can come together to mobilize in a wartime fashion misguided? He says no. Just look to COVID-19. The pandemic demonstrates something powerful can happen because when we name the crisis and then respond in a wartime scale action, we create a new sense of shared purpose, a renewed unity, and that liberates a level of political action that seemed previously impossible.
Well, so the book is about mobilizing for the climate emergency, and it invokes this wartime frame and says we need to go on to a wartime footing. And I'm saying we need to shift gears and adopt a wartime mindset to actually do this at the scale and speed we need to do it. We need to take an inventory of how many solar arrays do we need, how many wind turbines, how many electric buses, how many electric heat pumps, what's the new generation crown corporations we should be establishing to expedite doing that at scale and deploying it at scale to actually decarbonize and electrify in the short window of time that we have. And, so it takes leadership finally getting it, but at least we've now all gotten a taste in this pandemic. Ah, yes, this is what it looks and sounds and feels like when a government actually treats an emergency as an emergency. And it makes for such a stark contrast with the lackadaisical approach both our federal and provincial governments have taken on climate. In both COVID and the war, there are these instances where something clicks for the public, right? So in the war, it's the fall of France in June of 1940, right? That changes the popular zeitgeist about just how serious this is. With COVID, I don't know, maybe it was the cancellation of the NBA season. That's what I remember. Suddenly people were like, what, the NBA's canceled? This is serious. So first of all, what do I want from our government?
Right.
I want to see them adopt an actual emergency wartime footing, and I think there are a few signs of when you know that that's happened. We're getting a taste of that in the pandemic.
Yes.
You adopt a wartime or emergency mindset. That helps to liberate a kind of level of collective purpose and makes new things possible. You expect to see your government spend and invest to win. Right? Like we've seen in the pandemic, like we saw in the war, like we have decidedly not seen with respect to climate. You would expect them to create new economic institutions to get the job done. So that's what I mean by that new generation of crown corporations. And by the way, I still think there's a role for the private sector in all of this. But there was a huge role for the private sector in the Second World War, but what they didn't get to do was decide on the allocation of scarce resources, because you don't do that in an emergency. And I think that's the mindset we need today. I'm more interested in the issue of the distribution of income, because what we know is that the wealthiest 10% globally are responsible for, by far and away, the majority of GHG emissions. Yes. And in our own country, the wealthiest 20% of Canadians have about double the emissions of the poorest 20% of Canadians.
Right.
And the higher you go up the income ladder, the greater your runaway emissions.
Yeah.
So So what I'm actually saying in the book is part of the climate mobilization is also tackling inequality for two reasons, actually. One is because inequality drives increased emissions, GHG emissions, but also because that's how you win. That's how you mobilize people. That is one of the key lessons from the Second World War, is that inequality itself is toxic to social solidarity and society-wide mobilization. If you're asking people to truly rally in common cause, people need to know that everyone's in and everyone's doing their part. Part of what I'm arguing in the book is that, yeah, this is going to be harder and more challenging than our governments are telling you. Our governments are basically telling, you know, this is pretty easy, you can do it, you don't have to make any hard choices. And I'm trying to say, no, let's tell the truth. There are some hard choices.